Welcome to this session on correlating resonance. This is an aerial view of the Australian landscape. Now you know why Australian dot paintings look the way they do. My name is Jeff Ebbs. I know some of you from the International Sustainability Transitions Conference in 2022, where I presented a short paper. I'm joined here in Oslo by my colleague, Lewis Anzoni, and Luke's research gets a mention during the presentation. We're from Griffith University, an institution committed to sustainability with world-leading sustainability MBA and research. In this session, we're going to explore the reasons we embarked on this journey, the background, the process that emerged. So we'll also describe among those findings what the process actually is, how we do it, and finally how you might use it, which will also involve a discussion of why you should care, or why we hope you'll care. Very quickly summarising what I presented to IST 2022, I came from industry. I wanted to apply academic rigour to understanding why it was so hard to implement sustainable development. And I thought I might connect theory and practice through active research. So I wanted to map the relevant frameworks to specific problems. Checkland's 25-year-old FMA, framework, method, area of interest approach, underpins a whole school of abductive research and action research forming part of that. So the idea is that we don't ignore theory, we bring the theory into practice, but we don't limit ourselves to proving a set of hypotheses. So my research design followed that method. Our framework of ideas is a typology of research concepts, which we compared to a typology of practitioner responses by correlating the resonance between the two. At IST 2022, I only had a very basic idea of how we would do that correlation. What I expected is that we would create a framework that combined the typology of emerging from theory with the typology emerging from practice, and then we would use that combined multidimensional framework to position specific solutions and specific problems to identify the matches. And so here we see a three-dimensional space based on intent or outcome, factors and approaches. And so we talk to practitioners about their intention, the factors that influenced them and the approaches they had. Our initial findings, talking to sustainable food providers in southeast Queensland, identified that different groups focused on different normative outcomes. Each group saw different factors as important and took different approaches in response. So that was useful in understanding government policy and funding, but it was slightly different to the way that researchers had framed it. The theme that was common across both theory and practice was a recognition that there is a fundamental tension between economic growth and sustainable outcomes. There were two significant differences between theory and practice. One was the clustering of practitioners. So in this diagram, the yellow circles are clusters that emerged from the research that loosely, but not exactly, map onto the self-identified clusters recognised by practitioners. In terms of the methodology, the important difference was the focus by theoretical researchers on complexity and the focus of practitioners on normative intent. So every group identifies itself by configuration of outcomes. I care about social justice more than I care about environmental issues or profit. You care about social justice, environmental issues equally. You still don't care about profit very much. That person over there cares about economic growth and environmental issues and not so much about social justice. So this configuration of our intentions becomes a way that we define ourselves, and that in turn defines our responses to the factors that we encounter. So from a theoretical point of view, or even a theoretical point of view, understanding the centrality of intention is important. In ordering theories, Bernard Sovacool identified the fundamental difference between normative and descriptive research. To achieve impact, we need to go beyond researching the gaps in existing knowledge so that we can influence the outcomes. In short, normative research has some intent or recognises the importance of some intent. It goes beyond describing and explaining known phenomena. One of the implications of that assumption is consistent with the role of action research. It means that we will discover things that we don't know, the unknowns as they are known. So testing hypotheses is insufficient to identify the unknowns. Now, there's a difference between complexity and normativity. So most discussion of sustainability transitions refer to complexity. In most cases, researchers try to simplify the complexity. In Grubb's case here, in ordering complexity, he provides a framework that helps craft policy in the face of suboptimal decision-making due to interdependency of multiple variables. So his fuzzy curves define the limits of existing technology. And they're fuzzies precisely because of the normative dissonance between different groups. The reason that I singled out this paper, though, besides the fact that it's an example of simplifying complexity, is that he specifically starts by pointing out the difference between the focus on complexity in the theoretical research and the focus on shifting people's behaviour in the economic research. McCure, a year earlier, is using modelling to reduce complexity to manageable relationships. In this case, he's influencing or looking for ways to influence purchasing behaviour of electric vehicles. And what was significant in terms of what we're about to discuss is his focus on heterogeneous agents. So different people respond to different stimuli or respond to the same stimuli in different ways. And so policy needs to take account of those differences in behaviour, not assume that everybody's going to behave the same way. So both of these simplifications try and deal with that suboptimal or differential behaviour. Another way to simplify complexity is to assume a common vision and then iteratively converge on that vision. So Robert, with the framework for strategic sustainable development, assumes a funnel. You want to avoid the walls of the funnel, so you discard solutions that hit the walls of the funnel and focus on reiterating and refining solutions that move towards the shared vision. Krumdiex refined that to build her transitions engineering approach to get engineers to focus on the transition towards emissions reduction. The challenge is that they assume a common intent. So my research was finding that there's dissonance in the intention, and that's the difference in intentions that influence outcomes. Maya Gerpel, starting from an economic point of view, also recognised the importance of intention, and so she proposed additional layers to the multi-level protocol to provide the momentum to drive transitions in the MLP. So in Mindshift, her 2016 book, she adds 2 new layers. Individuals below the niche, me and you, we have ideas and conversations that increase the impact of the niche on the regime. And we also build a new narrative that creates a paradigm shift that changes the landscape. So there's a pincher mechanism that provides an intention, a normative outcome, which is a mechanism for creating momentum to drive change. It adds power to the MLP, but again, it assumes a commonality in the vision. While I was considering all of this, the UN released the Times of Crisis, Times of Change report. That was 12th of September 2023, almost exactly 9 months ago. And it reminds us all that despite our research and our best efforts, we haven't managed to well, we've possibly increased, but we haven't managed to achieve the transitions that we need to avoid the crisis that we're trying to avoid. So it became brutally obvious that the tension between economic growth and sustainable outcomes was not particular to my Southeast Queensland sustainable food providers. It's a global problem. So I went back to my data. Let's go and have a look at how I did that, where I was at, and how I actually started to address this challenge between normativity and complexity, between economic growth and sustainable outcomes. And I was specifically looking for whether there was any correlation between those two conflicting sets of concepts. So here's a map of concepts or themes appearing in a bunch of research papers. The counting of themes is a standard output from a systematic quantitative literature review or any thematic analysis and can be generated by software such as NVivo, which I used in this research. So by tracking the concepts as they evolved, we were applying the rigour that Joya calls for in the process of thematic analysis. And by having those as numerical values, we can start to compare the different frequency of concepts and look for correlations between them. So I normalised the frequency of the occurrence to make sure that I was comparing apples with apples, avoiding longer papers or concepts that were important in longer papers being counted more times than concepts that appeared in shorter papers. And I correlated the number of times each pair of concepts appear as important in the same paper. So you end up with a symmetrical process around the diagonal, because every concept agrees with itself. It considers itself to be very important, correlates with itself. Now, the diagram's not perfectly symmetrical because I introduced some weighting. I counted the number of times, say, for example, that business papers talked about money. So business papers always talk about money. Money papers don't always talk about business. So there is some directionality in the data. And again, we reduce this to a binary relationship. Do the two concepts appear as important, yes or no? So we can talk about the details of that method. By now, my supervisor, Dr. Zanzogni, was starting to tear his hair out. He had a full head of hair when I met him 2 years ago, and then when he saw what I was doing, he started to insist that I apply a bit more rigour to it. Why was I not just using standard clustering methods? So I went back and started to cluster the papers using different approaches, k-means, Gibbs sampling, and so on. So variations of the Monte Carlo methodology. And what I observed was that most clustering came up with similar kinds of outcomes, and it didn't matter whether we correlated whether we clustered the papers or whether we clustered the correlation between the concepts. We had good mapping between the correlation of the concepts and the correlations that appeared in the papers. The other thing, so that validated the approach of correlating concepts with each other. The other thing that was interesting to me was that all of the clustering methods isolated the most important concepts and the least important concepts. Where they got a bit fuzzy, where they were a bit harder to understand, and where they disagreed with each other was what happened in the middle. So I decided just to start with a simple sort. Let's just sort by importance. And so what we see is the density of the relationship between the concepts as highest in the top left and lowest in the bottom right. And the other thing that we see is there are some patterns emerging. Clearly there are groups of concepts that correlate with each other in the way they consider other concepts to be important. So we developed an algorithm that basically took the corner closest to the middle of the diagram and then iteratively sorted rows and columns to eliminate the white bits from that concept. Then we moved to the remaining corner of the graph and did the same thing. So we ended up with something that looks like that. So that identifies concepts that belong in each of the distinct clusters. So we can see the colour coding along the axis starting to group concepts based on the pattern that emerges in the body of the diagram. There are interesting things around the boundaries. There are interesting things happening in the outliers, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation. I've done this to about 18 different data sets and consistently get this type of diagram. And so I've reduced it down to this idealised form that I call the Stingray diagram. Some people say it looks like a stealth bomber. I say, well, stealth bombers look like Stingray because they're using biomimicry. Why take the copy when you can have the original? Now, if we look at that, analyse that Stingray diagram to a certain set of concepts, like take sustainable development, for example, the head of the big stingray might be about economic growth, and the tail end of that stingray might be growth at all costs. So they both largely agree with each other. Economic growth is really important, but there's a whole lot of things out on the wings of the stingray that disagree with growth at all costs. Now, the next stingray, the smallest stingray, which might be focused on sustainability rather than economic growth, largely agrees that economic growth is important. So social enterprise, for example, is applying economic methodology to try and produce impact. So it's focused on impact rather than growth, but it believes in using economic methods to use it. Right down in the bottom corner, we have degrowth, which disagrees with everybody else that economic growth is providing value. In fact, as a degrowth advocate, I believe that economic growth is a part of the problem, not part of the solution. So there's an explanation of what correlating resonance is, how the diagram emerges, or what the diagram that emerges looks like, and how we might read it. We can come back and analyse that in more detail during questions, but I want to go on to talk about the significance of that, how it's of use to us. So we implemented it to document the thematic analysis. So we can start to compare themes by looking at the numbers. What we found, which was unusual, is that we can analyse dissonance. We can identify the disagreement between themes. So instead of looking for an optimal solution, we're looking for the distinguishing characteristics. So that's where we deviated from most standard clustering mechanisms. One of the advantages of configurational analysis is that we can treat it as a Boolean truth table, and then we can reduce the number of things that we need to look at to perform our clustering. So if we take some of the concepts in columns 2, 4 and 5, we can very quickly identify which row we are in. So we can treat concepts from 2, 4 and 5 as a binary switch, and then we've got on, off, off, and so on as we go down the rows. So we can very quickly do a number of things. We can quickly cluster a group of texts. So as long as we've got pre-coded text, we could quickly do that clustering and identify which texts belong in which row. We could get a new text that hasn't been coded before, and we could quickly look for the concepts which we know are going to differentiate it between the clusters that we've already recognised. We can reveal new clusters, and we can use those new clusters to interrogate novel views. So for example, in our Stingray diagram looking at sustainable development, we said that item 2, the tail end of the large stingray, might be growth at all costs, and item 5, cluster 5, might be degrowth. So we don't see any row where growth at all costs and degrowth agree with each other. Hardly surprising. What happens if we put those people in a room, or if we search for papers that specifically talk about both of those issues? What happens if we look for commonality between those two groups? Then we might come up with some novel findings. So I did that in my community garden, where I live with a whole lot of growth at all cost people in the neighbourhood I live in Queensland. And so what I found is that we could agree that local food was useful and that cash is useful. Now, the reasons that we agreed on that are not clear, and it's a tentative alliance, but at least there's some form of alliance between these two fundamentally opposed groups. The way we approach sustainability and viability is quite different, but we are able to work together in the face of what we both agree is impending disaster. So, to check all of this, we applied it to a food inquiry. The Australian Parliament Standing Committee on Agriculture held an inquiry into food security. There were 180 submissions to that inquiry. We ran those submissions through this process, analysed them, identified that there were, the large stingray was let's grow more food. The second stingray was let's focus on food as a part of education, health and welfare, and think about food as an integrated, holistic solution to building a better society. Focus on well-being instead of economic growth. Interesting that the dissonance is similar. Anyway, what we find is that whenever we look at these complex social issues, we see similar things emerging. Feminism is an interesting example. Most people agree that the basis of feminism is that women should be treated equally to men. When we include First Nation women in that discussion, though, they say, no, there's men's business and women's business. We need to focus on the difference between men and women to create proper respect. Equality is a nonsense word that leads us astray. And so that forms an outlier, which we need to take into account if we're going to look at the intersection between feminist politics and race politics. So this approach, this diagram, helps us map and do the mathematics of dissonance. We hope that this can be applied to help us develop policy and find pathways to agreement that allow us to work together despite fundamental differences about what we believe is important. So thanks very much for your attention, and now I'll open it up to questions.